So when I finished university way back, almost 2 decades ago now, which feels like a long time, I had heard about this really cool initiative happening in Regent Park, which is one of Canada's oldest social housing neighborhoods. It's right in downtown Toronto, and back in the early 2000s, that community had identified that they had had a really significant challenge with their dropout rate. And at that time, I think more than 55% of the kids in that community weren't graduating from high school. And so they felt like they needed to do something as a community to come together and help those students to graduate from high school and to go on to post-secondary. So they created a program at that time called Pathways to Education, and they wanted to make sure that it was available to all the kids in that community. And so over 90% of those kids ended up enrolling in the program, and it had 4 different supports in that program. It had tutoring support, so students got specific one-on-one help with homework after school. It had mentoring support, so it exposed students to different kinds of mentors, career mentors, personal mentors, different kinds of opportunities that students may not necessarily have access to. So tutoring support, mentoring support. It also provided financial support at the time, so it gave out scholarships to students for participation in the program. So students would get up to $1,000 a year for post-secondary education for each year they participated in the program. And then the last support that they got was they had this one-on-one personal support worker was what the person was called, and they knit everything together, and they really liaised with the school and with the home and with the student to make sure everything was on track. So back in 2000, I worked in government at the time, but I graduated from university with a Bachelor of Education, and I wasn't using it. So I thought, I've got to volunteer in some capacity. So I found out about this really cool initiative called Pathways to Education, and I decided, hey, this looks like something I could actually volunteer in. And I ended up taking my car down to Regent Park from Queen's Park, getting out of my business suit, going in and mentoring with these really amazing, wonderful young people in Regent Park. And that really spurred a whole love of place-based approaches to making community change. I volunteered there that year. I went on to do the Masters of Education, looking at the ways that youth understand space and place and how they feel connected to the communities that they live in and the ways that different organizations support or enable their involvement in community. And then I ended up moving back to Canada after I did my Masters. I did my Masters over in the UK, moved back to Canada, moved to Kitchener-Waterloo and started a PhD around place-based change and the role of youth in place-based change. But at the same time that that happened, there was this national rollout of this program called Pathways to Education across 6 new communities in Canada. One of them happened to be Kitchener-Waterloo. And I happened to stand at this community event beside the person who was bringing the event to the community, and she was talking to someone else, and I said, hey, I know a little bit about that program. And she said, oh, we're looking to hire our inaugural director. Are you interested in applying? And I said, sure, I'd love to. So I applied for the job, and I ended up starting that program in Kitchener-Waterloo, and then going on to become the National Vice President of Programs and Research and doing my PhD on the work of poverty reduction and place-based change. So it's funny also how a small thing turns into a big thing and having a whole career trajectory that unfolds. So I spent about 10 years of my life working in that particular program. It rolled out, Pathways to Education ended up rolling out across up to 20 communities, I think, across Canada. In that particular community in Regent Park, it reduced the dropout rate from 15% to under, or for 56% to under 10%.
Wow.
4 years of operation. So it had huge impacts and became quite a innovative model for making change in communities where they were challenged by low income levels and poverty, and also high dropout rates or barriers around educational attainment. So yeah, that became quite a focus for me over 10 years of my career, and from that it just sort of exposed me to different ways of thinking about community change and around how nonprofits can play a catalytic role in neighborhoods to really bring about whole, comprehensive community change efforts. So yeah, that's a little bit about my background and a little.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So how important was evaluation and measuring those impacts from an early time? I mean, because obviously you would, that sounds like, you know, you rolled out quite a few different parts of the program. There were different initiatives. How important was evaluation from the beginning?
Yeah, so one of the things about that program particularly was that it had a very rigorous evaluation model, and that it measured a lot of stuff right from the very early stages. So they were able to measure by postal code how many students were not being successful in high school. That was a really critical baseline data piece that the program was able to capture and work with. And then they were also able to track things like school attendance, each semester, year over year, and look at the changes that were made in school attendance rates. They were able to track things like academic performance, how well students were doing in school and changes in that, and also students' perception towards how they felt about school. And they were also able to then track where students were able to go on to post-secondary. So those were really important measures that were critical to that program's success. One of the other things about that program that I think made it really attractive to funders was that it worked with at least 80% of the students in a particular community. So it worked in communities where there was the highest dropout rates in Canada and some of the highest poverty rates, because not every community that has a high poverty rate has lots of families living in it. So even identifying the communities where those two measures were at play was important, and was some work that had never been done in Canada. So identifying those communities, and then also more so identifying that there was a community interest and a community partner or some capacity locally to really take a program like this and bring it to that community and have it be something that was owned by the community were critical pieces. One of the other things I'll just flag, and this is, you're asking me to kind of reflect on stuff, Ruth, that's from a while ago, but the social return on investment work, I don't know how well that's rolled out in Australia, but within the Canadian context, way back in the like 2008, 2010, that time frame, there was quite a lot of interest around social impact and social return on investment work, ROI stuff. And not a lot of organizations in Canada had actually been able to comprehensively do that work because it was costly. It required almost expert organizations to come in and facilitate it. But one of the things about this program was that it was really well loved by business people as well, because business people saw that if they could invest finances or resources into a program like this, it had a huge preventative outcome in terms of preventing other things like involvement in the criminal justice system or in the healthcare system or in other types of systems that end up costing way more money down the road. So Pathways at the time was able to work with the Boston Consulting Group, which was a huge advantage, and they were able to do a really comprehensive SROI analysis, and they were able to identify the fact that if you could invest $1, I believe in Pathways, that you were able to save $25 down the road in terms of other downstream costs. So that kind of analysis was really critical in order to be able to get more funding and more resources for this program and to be able to help it scale. And so that was one of the great benefits, was that the evaluation really was rigorous, it was comprehensive, it involved many students in the community, and it ended up contributing to the ability of that program to scale to other communities and to get more resources. So it was a whole key piece in how that program grew and expanded to become more of a national program. So that's a bit of a long story about the importance of evaluation in that work, but they also invested heavily and saw the importance of having an evaluator embedded in the program so that they could use the learning that was happening on a regular basis to improve the program, to tweak it, to not only collect data, but also to really think through how the program was being delivered, and to take those lessons and help other communities in that scale-up approach. So evaluation was really critical, both for the program delivery component, but also to help support fundraising efforts to get more resources for it.
Yeah, look, that's fantastic, and it sounds like there was a whole lot of stakeholders involved. And certainly here, one of the things that I've been sort of, talking with people about, but also, reflecting on as well, is how you build the evaluation capacity of knowledge and skills throughout, obviously, the organisation, but with other stakeholders, it's sometimes external stakeholders or funders as well. How do you manage to bring everyone together and explain, the importance of evaluation, maybe even as a starting point, but then build people's capacity to participate in evaluation. Any tips?
Yeah, that's great. We were talking briefly about that the other day, Ruth, but one of my beliefs is that lots of people think evaluation is a dirty word, and that there's a whole bunch of stigma around it, whereas I think it's really critical for organizations and for leaders in organizations just to really activate the curiosity that they have about what it is that they're doing, and to start from that perspective around, let's get curious about the change that we're making through our activities and how we might begin to build some systems that will help us sort that out a little bit better. So using curiosity from a leadership perspective, and also from those around the leader in terms of identifying what's happening, what's working, what's not working. Those are some basic cornerstones of doing good evaluation. Not imagining or presupposing that you have the answer to the question, but just coming up with the questions that you're interested in. I think it's hard for often leaders and organizations to be able to take that time to step back and say, okay, so what is it that we're curious about? What do we want to learn about in terms of either our organization or the people that we serve or the community in which we work, or any of those kinds of questions I think are really critical questions for organizations to be able to do good reflective practice. I think one of the experiences I've had is I've had the opportunity to help coach and mentor organizations around doing good strategic learning and strategic thinking, which is another way of talking about evaluation.
Yes.
So one of the challenges I think organizations get themselves into is they really get focused on the data or the measurement, and they often end up collecting all of this stuff just to feed the beast, and often the beast is either a funder or a stakeholder or a partner in some way, shape, or form. They need to get this data to funnel out to those different players, and oftentimes that prevents them from being able to take a step back and look at the whole picture and get much more curious about what it is they want to learn, how they might go about learning it, and then putting in some very basic accountability, I think, within the organization to be able to capture those learnings on a routine basis. So I think stepping away from the measurement and looking at the learning is really helpful for organizations to destigmatize some of that work of evaluation. So I could point folks to some great resources from Capacity Canada. We ran some boot camps called eValue that helped organizations think through some of those evaluation and learning questions. But there's lots of tools out there, and I think just committing a little bit of time on a weekly basis even to having a small little practice group within an organization, 1 or 2 or 3 people who are going to come together who are going to talk about it regularly and figure out some strategies or some tactics to help move the evaluation piece forward is a practical way to do it. It doesn't have to be this big comprehensive thing. It can be just a routine, let's sit down and chat about what we're learning and how we're going to put some systems in place to help capture those learnings. So yeah, I don't know, those are some basic thoughts
fantastic.
on evaluation, but not focus on the measurement so much and just focus more on the learning, which is hard for organizations who have to feed funding proposals or reporting deadlines or whatever. But yeah, trying to find a little bit of that space to think a little bit more reflectively is critical.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that sometimes organisations can kind of see evaluation as that compliance. We've got to just do it because of our funder or, what we're expected to do. Whereas when you talk about it in terms of reflective practice, strategic thinking, it becomes part of the culture to actually think and maybe address some of our assumptions that we make about our programs and services. And really, as you say, I love the idea, being curious and saying, well, what is data or what is information or feedback telling us, and understanding that is evaluation, and it also feeds our ability to do strategic thinking and decision making in such a better way when we have greater insights through our evaluation processes. Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing I think, as you're talking, Ruth, it makes me think about is the culture of the organization.
Yes.
Depending on the kind of culture of the organization that folks are working in, there may or may not be a real emphasis on learning or not, right? So even being mindful as a worker in an organization about what kind of a culture am I working in here, and where is their capacity to think differently or to redesign approaches to solving complex problems. I think that's one of the big challenges facing the nonprofit sector is we get into the business of doing in either servicing individuals or solving environmental challenges or whatever the issue is. It's a doing activity, and we don't often have that capacity to step back and say, well, so how is our doing actually changing outcomes or actually making a difference in terms of those that we're trying to serve? So yeah, it's I think one of those tensions in the work of nonprofits. We do a lot of service work in nonprofit organizations, and sometimes that service isn't actually impacting those big, hairy challenges that we're all facing.
So do you think it's the role of leadership to really define that culture, that learning culture? Like, what is the role of leadership to make that kind of, an important part of a culture?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Ruth. I don't know what the answer is for that one necessarily, because I do think boards play a big role in that. The executive director or the CEO really sets the tone for those pieces. But I also think there's opportunities for individual staff to think through, hey, I've got this new idea that I want to try. Is there a way to pilot it on a very small scale level even, or push out some new thinking around it? I really like some of the work of I think it's 4-quadrant, the emergent learning framework. I think I referenced it to you. And people can Google that if they want to. But that tool, if it's well utilized, gives people the opportunity just to spark 1 or 2 new activities that can start to shift or shape different ways of thinking. So doesn't have to be, whole-scale revolution necessarily, but it could be small actions of tiny changes that can help to shift a focus on something new or something different, for sure. And I think the other piece of it is a willingness to fail. So, I mean, I've coached some organizations, and organizations might say, yep, we're willing to fail. Yep, we're willing to fail. But what does that actually look like in terms of practice? What's the practice of failure within the organization? How comfortable are people actually rolling something out that is a complete and utter flop and being okay with it? That is something that's, we do a lot of talk around that, but we actually have very limited capacity to actually use resources toward big failures. And that is something that we need to get a little bit more comfortable with, both as individuals and as organizations, in terms of how we allow ourselves to do that. There was a movement maybe 5 years or so ago in Canada anyway that talked around putting out these failure reports. So organizations were writing failure reports, and I don't know if that happened in Australia as well, but definitely a shift towards, let's talk about all the things that went really bad or really wrong so that we can learn from them and try to course correct or try to think about where the innovation might come from in terms of the failures. So that was something that was a shift a little while ago, and definitely some folks in Canada who are really playing around with that notion of failing fast, failing often, and being okay with that. I do think it's hard for organizations often to be able to actually let themselves do that. So got to think through, how much do we say we're going to fail, and actually how much do we actually allow ourselves to do it? That's a challenge, I think.
Yeah, I agree. We talk about it a lot more easily than we actually do it. Yes. Can I just maybe ask you a basic question, really just about definitions? We're using the word capacity quite a lot in this conversation, but I'd really like to, and obviously Capacity Canada is using it in their name, but I'm actually just really interested to hear what your thoughts are on what capacity means. Because, what does capacity mean to you, or what does it look like?
Yeah, so that's a good question, Ruth. I think it relates to the ability of individuals, organizations, networks, and systems to be able to have the skills, the resources, the knowledge, the power necessary to actually make change happen. So I think there's a whole bunch of different theoretical models around capacity. I think the language in Australia relates more to capabilities or capacity.
We use both.
Both. Yeah, so I think there's a slight nuanced change there, but in terms of language maybe, but the capacity notion I think is around how what is your ability to actually make change happen?
Yeah.
On a program level or on an outcome level. What do you need to be able to do that, to be effective at doing that? And what are the resources that you might need to acquire, either as a leader or as an organization or as a network, to actually make that happen? So
yeah,
I think there's the whole field of capacity building is something that in the Australian context, I think looks pretty different than what it does within the Canadian context. And I think we don't have as diversified a field in Canada of capacity builders, either consultants or peak bodies or other kinds of supports. Even funders might be capacity builders, but we don't have as diversified of a landscape, I don't believe, in Canada as you guys have here in Australia. That's my brief assumption or my brief sort of observation. And we in the Canadian context, we don't really fund the work of capacity builders in the same, we don't have a robust funding culture for capacity builders. So everyone's assumed to have had or to have capacity, but how organizations actually build it becomes somewhat challenging when there's not direct operating funds for organizations or open funding sources for them to be able to use those funds for basic operating expenses. So there's, I think, often this push and pull, at least from a funder perspective to an org perspective, around how to build capacity at that organizational level. And that's where organizations, I think, have to get really strategic and really creative and innovative around how they build organizational capacity. So yeah, just a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, that's really good. And I'm just thinking as you're talking that you can build the capacity maybe in terms of mindsets or beliefs, but then if you don't have the systems or the processes or the technology to support you to deliver on something, then it's kind of, you're not building capacity in all of the areas. So you need to look at many different ways to build capacity, don't you?
So Capacity Canada has rolled out a number of different kinds of programs or services to support that building capacity question for different stakeholder groups. They've been really successful at a bunch of different kinds of programs, like they run a board governance boot camp, for instance, where they bring together the executive director or the CEO of the organization and the board chair for a very intensive focused learning program, and learning about the basics of board governance, but also how to apply those learnings into the organizational context to support more strategic thinking and strategic action at an organizational level. They've also done some innovative stuff called, an innovative program called TechMatch, where they're matching technology workers to organizational or social challenges or problems, to have there be a better synergy between the skills and abilities of tech workers with those within the nonprofit sector. So, I mean, small nonprofits often don't have huge tech expertise or tech capacity, but the tech world has lots of individuals who are quite keen to volunteer, quite keen to give some of their knowledge and know-how to complex social challenges. So figuring out those intersections and the cross-stakeholder cross-sector opportunities, Ruth, I think are really critical for organizations to be able to be innovative and to drive kind of new approaches to change in their organizations and in the work they do. So I could list out the programs, but if folks want to take a look at that website at Capacity Canada, then they might see some of the different kinds of ways that Capacity Canada anyway is thinking through how to build individual, organizational, and network capacity. So yeah, just a couple.
So we have to build capacity for our current work, but we also have to think about future and, where not only the problems are lying and the challenges, but also what we'll need to address some of those complex problems in the future. So gosh, there's a lot in this, isn't there? Because you've got to, think about what do we need now, but what do we need to in the future? So how do you prepare organisations for the future as well as what we're currently doing?
Yeah, I think that's a tough question. I was kind of curious what other folks are doing in terms of that disruption piece, but I do believe that imagining the future that might exist and doing some scenario planning, for instance, around possible futures is a really solid tool to help organizations think through what that might look like. There's been a lot of, I think, chat in Canada anyway about the future of work, for instance, and some emerging conversations around the future of work within the nonprofit sector, realizing that there are lots of different sectors within that sector. But if you think through the broad question of how are organizations, for instance, preparing for disruptions within workforces? So within the Canadian context anyway, we were seeing an aging demographic within organizations and within the workforce. We're seeing the rise of millennial workers and a different approach to work within that context. And we're seeing people want to make tremendous meaning in the kinds of work they're doing and looking for opportunities within organizations to contribute to having meaningful types of work and employment opportunities. But work and how work is being conceptualized looks somewhat different within organizational contexts right now, and it's going to look even more different within 5 years. I don't know that technology is going to get rid of all sorts of jobs, but I definitely think there will be a different role for technology to emerge, and there is a looming big disruption, I think, that's not necessarily being well planned for across all sorts of organizations, and that's just one example of the kinds of disruption that I think is on the horizon. I think there's disruption happening in terms of how funders want to work with organizations and the availability of funding sources for different nonprofits to actually do the kind of work they want to do. And I think there's an opportunity to really get innovative around how to work together to address some of those shifts. Capacity Canada is using some a great tool around design thinking, and they're rolling out something called Capacity by Design to help organizations use design thinking to solve really critical and emergent problems. And I'm not an expert on design thinking, but I have seen that it does generate some really interesting outcomes in terms of process for the organizations that are using it. And I think that is a tool that might help organizations imagine a different kind of future and to build different kinds of scenarios to help address that emerging unknown future. So I think I don't know, it's hard, that question too, for organizations, because we don't exactly know what the future is going to hold, but we can begin to imagine what it might look like and begin to think about it in different ways and to be planful about it, but also creative and open to what might emerge. So lots of opportunity there.
Yeah, definitely. We're doing a lot of talking around design thinking and human-centered design and how we use that and the tools that come alongside that methodology to help us think about complex problems and as you say, what the future might look like as well, and how we're going to address some of those. And I did actually see that in Capacity Canada's resource section, you've got a lovely little guide there about design thinking. So that's fantastic. And I was going to tell people about that because I think the more that people can learn about design thinking and what it includes and how it can help them, that's really fantastic. So that's great.
And I think the tension in some of that group work, as we're talking about it, is many organizations that I have worked with or that I know about struggle to keep the lights on, right? So it becomes this kind of dichotomy around how do you build capacity to be innovative and to do really interesting work that's going to solve really complex, big problems while simultaneously ensuring that you can pay your workers, keep the lights on, pay the rent, those become pretty significant challenges for organizations to be able to mediate and to resolve. So I don't want to undermine the challenges facing frontline service organizations and the complexities of that work. And I acknowledge that there's lots of good problems that are facing organizations around how to be able to do both. Either or, I think it's both and it's how do you eke out the space to be able to think through some of those challenging scenarios in a future sense.
So as a leader, what do you think we should be focusing on, like to support ourselves in this, when there's so many things that we could be putting our energy into? What do you think supports leaders most in this, as you said, quite stressful sometimes, between just surviving but also thriving and really building our organization's impact.
Yeah, I was curious about what the practices are here that folks are actually implementing for themselves as leaders. I think within the Canadian context, or the context that I'm familiar with, there's often this sense of the team that folks are on in terms of finding funding, finding different opportunities, doing the work, feeding that funder's needs, and that sense of burnout, I think, is quite high amongst CEOs and amongst leaders in organizations, or the sense of feeling very alone in the work that they're doing. So I think opportunities for folks who are in those leadership roles to step back a little bit, to come together with their peers is really critical, to actually do some of that honest and vulnerable conversation around, geez, this has been really hard for us to figure out, or to learn from other organizations, and having that mindset to be interested and curious rather than having all of the answers is really essential for leaders in organizations. Asking for help, I think, is really important. So knowing who the trusted resources are to be able to go to say, listen, I'm having a really hard time with X, Y, or Z. I think this center is a good example of a trusted resource where there's lots of great expertise, lots of know-how in terms of exposure to problems that they've seen before, and being able to help problem solve those for other organizations, really critical. I think that reflective practice piece for leaders is really important. Being able to step back and see what the whole picture looks like rather than just your piece of that picture. And that notion of perspective taking. Being able to say, okay, so identifying the perspective you're in, giving it some vocabulary, giving it some language, giving your perspective even a geography or a terrain, and then being able to say, okay, so what if I were to look at the problem from the perspective of the light switch? How would the light switch look at it? So just kind of like that other very out of the cerebral way, and imagining it from someplace else, what would that problem look like from a different perspective? So it's hard when you're in the midst of it to be able to step out and do that. But the other thing I would say is working with a mentor or a coach, especially if you're a young leader or you're a new leader, finding people who you really feel like you can connect with and can learn from in a mentoring relationship is really critical in terms of how you evolve and grow. Even if you're in the later stage of your career, having a mentor or coach is a great idea too. So I think there are lots of different strategies, and the challenge becomes finding the time to do it and making it priority, right? Because the burnout piece, I think, can be very real for folks doing the work. So figuring out how to prioritize self-care, something I always talk about with teams that I work with, that self-care piece is really, really important, and figuring out ways to have the challenging conversations in your team or with the people you work with is also an important skill that requires commitment and focus. So not easy stuff, but does require time and attention, I think, Ruth, to make it happen.
Yeah, definitely. All great ideas and strategies and things that we need to remember, because if we don't take care of ourselves, but if we're not leading and showing, our teams or our organizations how we expect them to behave as well in terms of self-care and in reflective practice and creative thinking, if we don't do it as leaders, then they're most likely not to do it. So we have to really try and role model what we want other people to do as well.
The thing is, I guess the other reflection or comment I had was that intergenerationally, or different folks across an organization, depending on age and stage, are going to need different things in terms of their own self-care, their own wellness, their own ability to recharge, right? So as a leader, being mindful of how to implement those practices across an organization, or acknowledging that not a one-size-fits-all approach is going to be the solution to help support leaders and those working in organizations to do this work, I think is a challenge or an opportunity really for those that are at the leadership, helm of leadership, or at the helm of the organization,
So where does this mean you're at now, Megan? Like, what are you working on now? What's the biggest topics for you as an individual? What does your next few years look like?
So I'm really curious about how places build capacity. So I think it's really interesting how organizations can build capacity, but the question of how do places build capacity to solve complex problems is something that I'm quite interested in. and do certain types of places have more capacity or have different kinds of capacity at their disposal. So, you know, I live in a rural community. We have different kinds of challenges, different kinds of opportunities, and different availability to resources, for instance, financial resources. So how do different kinds of places that look very different build different kinds of capacity? So that's kind of a broad research question that I'm interested in, Ruth. I am really interested also in the question of how do young people play a role in terms of organizational change or getting involved in the sector, and the kinds of opportunities from an experiential learning perspective that organizations for young people to be able to build career paths. That's a question I'm interested in. And the other thing I would just flag that within the Canadian context anyway, there's a big push right now to think through the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yes.
So that's sort of this question I think that lots of organizations are going to be exposed to or need to think through around how does their work connect to those Sustainable Development Goals? What are the ways that impact can be traced to those? And I think there's some opportunity to think through how are different jurisdictions like Australia or the UK or the United States looking at those frameworks around supporting the work of the nonprofit sector to actually make progress towards those goals. So those are some buckets of things that I'm thinking about, Ruth. But yeah, I think there's lots of opportunities to learn from Australia in terms of how capacity builders are doing work here, and how there's a different kind of a culture or a landscape around the work of capacity builders. But yeah, lots of opportunities, I think, when you step out of your own context also to be able to think differently about the problems that you might be facing or experiencing, for sure.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I just wanted to open it up. Wendy, did you want to ask any questions? Natalia, do you have anything that you'd like to ask Megan?
So I might kick off, and Natalia, we're happy to unmute you at any point. But I guess cross-sector work is something that we're seeing a lot more of. So have you been involved in examples where there's government, there's philanthropy, there's the community, perhaps there's corporates, and how vibrant is that scene?
So I would speak, one of the great examples, Wendy, for myself was working with that pathways to education example. So very interestingly, one of the observations that the initial leaders or the founders of that program identified is that real change happens at the intersections of sectors, or at the outsiders or the very margins of a system. And I thought that that was a fascinating observation because they were able to identify a challenge related to high school graduation. So they were able to work with the Department of Education, or the Ministry of Education and school boards, which are a whole entire system unto themselves, at least in the Canadian context. There's a lot of bureaucracy around how school boards operate. They were able to work with community partners and community players and community organizations that were very embedded, but they were also able to bring in organizations like Ernst & Young and different kinds of for-profit corporations that had an interest in supporting their staff to practice mentoring skills, for instance, which is a different, a unique or a value add for the organization or the corporation also to say, hey, we want to help our employees to build some different kinds of skills. Our employees are interested in volunteering, so bringing them into the conversation. Ultimately, the provincial government or the equivalent to the state government was very interested in saying, we want to help, we want to figure out ways to reduce dropout rates. We don't have all the answers, but we realize that there are examples like this program that have answers, so we're willing to fund it, and we're willing to invest some good money into it. But there were a whole bunch of different kinds of partnerships that emerged because of that example. One of the ones that I often reflect on when I was the director of that program in Kitchener, Waterloo, which is a town about an hour and a half west of Toronto, we were able to partner with the symphony, for instance, and to say students in this community don't have a lot of access to music. And so they were very willing to come in and to perform and to do concerts in the community, to provide music lessons, to provide instruments. It was something that they had never actually seen there to be a challenge or to have barriers around, but having the conversation with them really sparked the opportunity, and the partnership really evolved from the conversation. So that was one thing that one thing I love doing in my career is I like building partnerships, but it often starts just with a basic conversation and identifying what the need is, and then sorting out who are the various people that might have an interest in supporting this, and thinking through how there can be benefit that can get generated for both ends of that partnership is something that I do love doing. So that was a good example of building lots of different cross-sectoral kinds of partnerships for sure. Capacity Canada's their example of a TechMatch program. They're also really working extensively with Manulife, which is a large insurance company across Canada. Their employees are very interested in doing board work, but they often don't know where to go, for instance, or where there are boards that are looking. So they've created a program called Board Match, which links corporate employees with nonprofit boards to build board capacity, but also to support the corporate employee who's looking for a really meaningful voluntary experience. So I think there are really great problems get solved when you bring different kinds of people together to work and to think through them, and we all come from different mindsets or different perspectives or different trainings or disciplines, and there's real creativity and synergy, I think, that can happen when you put those people in a room together and say, hey, how could we solve that problem? So, yeah.
Fantastic.
So we're pretty much out of time. I can't believe it, Megan. We've had such a great conversation and it's just been so interesting, and thank you so much for talking to us and to hear from you and your insights into the work that you're doing. And we're certainly very excited to collaborate with you into the future and see what else we can do together in terms of building capacity. So thank you, Megan. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks, Ruth, for the opportunity, and nice to meet everybody, and you especially, Natalia. Yep, thank you.